Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 171, The Founder of Moama. Part 1. James Maiden was born on the 28th of September 1814 in Mow Green, Newchurch in Rossendale, Lancashire, England. When he was baptised, only his mother was listed, Mary Maiden, spelt without the I. So the presumption is that he was born illegitimate. On the 8th of March 1834, at the age of 19, he was convicted at the Lancashire Assizes and was given 7 years transportation. Interestingly, his future rival, Henry Hopwood, was also tried on the same day in the same assizes. He was a farm labourer at the time of his conviction, and he came out on the Bengal merchant that left England on the 27th of September 1834 and arrived in New South Wales on the 30th of January 1835. James, alongside Thomas Evans, 22, Cornelius Taylor, 22, and Henry Green, 21, were indicted for breaking into the house of Emmanuel Cantrell at Droylsden near Manchester and stealing 4 silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, 2 caster tops and other articles. The sentence of death was recorded against them, with the intimation that they would be transported for life. So in the end, he got off quite lightly. His convict record stated that he was not educated, he couldn't read or write, he was Protestant, single, from Lancashire, 5'7", with brown hair and grey eyes. In the 1837 muster, he was recorded as being assigned to Peter Stuckey, who featured in bonus episode 15. Peter Stuckey later purchased Mathower Run near Moama late in 1842. James was granted a ticket of leave in 1839 in Goulburn, and he received his certificate of freedom on the 11th of November 1841. A year earlier, he married Jane Davies at St John's in Camden on the 9th of November 1840 when James was 26 and Jane 21. Jane had come out on the James Paterson as a free settler. When they asked permission to marry, Jane was residing at Sutton Forest, and James was serving under Reverend George Michael. At the time, permission was granted on the 23rd of October 1840. Jane and James had 7 children together. James became an assigned servant working as a stockman for a relative, John Clark, who held the lease of Turringabbie and Echuca runs on the Murray River, some 30 kilometres west of Moama. In about 1840, he drove some of Clark's cattle across the Yass Plains to Echuca and Turringabbie, which was firstly known as Long Swamp Run, in the search of green feed during a prolonged drought, and he remained there as John Clark's superintendent. In 1845, he established a punt, which became known as Maiden's Punt, at a crossing over the Murray River on the New South Wales side of Echuca, and this was the beginning of the town of Moama. Huge numbers of stock crossed the river from 3 stock routes that converged to a point immediately above the punt. The most important of those stock routes was from Wilcannia via Deniliquin, where it was joined by another route via Hay, and both carried stock from as far as north as Queensland. During the pastoral era, enormous numbers of cattle and sheep traversed these routes across southwestern New South Wales, also drawing stock from other small feeder routes. Maiden's Punt was the first commercial punt in the area, and it provided a vital crossing over the Murray for stock moving over the state border from New South Wales into Victoria, thereby linking inland stock breeding areas with southern markets. These movements provided meat on the table for miners and southern city dwellers and endorsed the reputation of New South Wales as the food source for people living south of the Murray. By its presence, Maiden's Punt facilitated the transfer of animals and drovers to the Victorian side of the river. Maiden's Punt was the only punt on the Murray River for many river miles. The nearest was at Swan Hill and possibly at Waganya at the time. For some 8 years, from 1845 to 1853, Maiden's Punt was the sole means of crossing the Murray in that area, and for most of the years following the discovery of gold in Bendigo in 1851, when the stock crossing numbers were at their peak. As a result of the discovery of gold, stock numbers crossing the Murray increased dramatically, and between 1851 and 1856, Moama became the largest cattle mart outside Melbourne. The figures showed that between June 1856 and June 1857, nearly 34,500 cattle, Nearly 111,000 sheep and 1,700 horses crossed on Maidens and, later on, Hopwood's punts. Local estimates put the number of sheep at 200,000 annually at this time. By 1858 and 1859, the number of sheep had doubled and cattle and horse numbers trebled. Most cattle swam across, with the punt carrying drays, stores and drovers. As a result, Maiden prospered and huge deals were conducted in the atmosphere of his bar he called the Junction Inn. But things changed when miners began to move away from the diggings as the gold petered out, and by 1857 Maiden had been forced to sell all of his Moama assets. Where cattle prices previously had been £10 to £12 per head, by 1861, the year that Maiden sold Echuca, they'd collapsed to £3. Surveyor Thomas Townsend's plan of Maiden's punt at Moama, dated April 1851, showed where the punt was placed and how it fitted in with the routes within New South Wales and Victoria. In 1845, Maiden moved his punt from Echuca to his strategic position in Moama, where three main stock routes converged, the most important coming from Wilcannia via Deniliquin, and there was one from the west, titled the Lower Murray, and another from the east, from around Barmer. Most stock was heading to the slaughter yards at Bendigo and some to Melbourne markets. In 1856, Maiden's punt sank with a load of bricks destined for use for the rebuilding of his original inn and was scrapped. A better punt was constructed locally for £700 by Leonard, a builder who became the owner. It was 100 feet long and wide enough to carry 2 drays abreast, thus being able to carry 4 drays and 600 sheep in one crossing. The punt was launched in great style in February 1857 and was still in commission in 1865 when a fatal accident occurred on the Victorian side near the punt gangway. It ceased around 1870 when Old Moama was wiped out by the worst flood in living memory, resulting in all of the public buildings having to be rebuilt on higher ground. This, combined with the ascendancy of Hopwood's empire on the other side of the river at Echuca, led to the terminal decline of Old Moama and the site of Maiden's former glory. In 1853, another former convict named Henry Hopwood, the founder of Echuca, who I covered in episode 131, installed a punt across the Murray from Echuca on the Victorian side, which was 3 kilometres downstream from Maiden's crossing. Traffic was then gradually shared between the two punts, which operated for many years until eventually Maiden's ageing punt was eclipsed by Hopwood's newer ferry and grander inn. Following Maiden's departure from Moama in about 1857, the area stagnated for the want of a leader, while across in Victoria, Hopwood was beginning to develop an empire. So it was only for a short period that the two punts competed, and this was a result of local politics. Hopwood sought to have a monopoly over all crossings in and out of the Riverina, and to this end bought Maiden's former punt from a coach company in 1862. Watt, who bought the junction in shortly afterwards, re-centred Hopwood's entry into Moama and his purchase of a punt that had always been associated with the inn, and he therefore set up a free punt a short distance from Maiden's, which ran for a few years. By 1865, Leonard owned both punts, but by then only one was in use. Most travellers used Hopwood's crossing until a substantial bridge was built in Echuca in 1878. On the 20th of January 1847, there was an article titled Charge of Fraud. William Payne was brought before Archibald McLaughlin Esquire JP at the police office yesterday, charged by Mr John Clark of Goulburn with having fraudulently obtained the sum of £8 and 10 shillings from him on the 25th of June 1846 in Melbourne. James Maiden, superintendent of Mr Clark's station on the Murray, deposed to having paid the prisoner, who was a shepherd, the above £6 10 shillings prior to his leaving the station. The witness was asked several questions by the magistrate, to whom he stated, "I have paid the prisoner by a draft on Bella and Buchanan, purporting to be drawn by a man named Hogg, which I endorsed over to him, and received his receipt in full of all demands. I have been in the habit of paying the men on the station by orders in my own name. I never state or mention Mr Clark's name in any of them. I am his overseer. I cannot produce any written documents now that could prove the payment of the sum mentioned to witness." Worship mentioned that if Mr Clark chose to pay men moneys without having stronger reasons for so doing, he must abide the loss, and the prisoner was discharged. And 2 months later, the co-partnery carried on between the undersigned under the firm of Gemmell and Maiden at the Junction Inn, Lower Murray, is his stay dissolved by mutual consent, All debts due by the concern will be paid by the subscriber, James Maiden, who is authorised to receive all debts due to the firm. So initially, James must have obviously had a partner that he went into in order for the building and the running of the Junction Inn. James held the licence of the Junction Inn from 1847 to 1856. The inn was the equivalent of the stock market, with big deals being made there. And the description of Maiden's punt on the 4th of August 1848 says at Maiden's punt at the junction of the Campaspe Murray rivers, and James Maiden to be postmaster. On the 12th of October 1848, it states the landowners in the area and has John Clark, named as owning the run of Long Swamp or Pig-Faced Plain with an area of 125,000 acres, with a grazing capacity of 1,000 cattle and 10,000 sheep. And then it also mentions that there's a run that's occupied by James Maiden on the east 10 miles 60 chains by the line south, and also on the River Murray. On the 27th of January 1852, when he was in his prime, James actually had 3 acres and 2 roods of land in South Deniliquin, so he branched out with his investments. And on the 9th of March 1855, there were a total of 13 title deeds for properties in Moama. And on the 29th of November 1855, it says that the War Relief Fund, the trustees acknowledged the sum of 10 guineas as per Messrs Rowe and Company from the men on the station of James Maiden, Esquire, at Turumbury. So he certainly had a bit of land scattered about on the New South Wales side of the river and the Victorian side. On the 7th of January 1856, there was announced a transfer of licence. Mr James Maiden of Moama, Maiden's Punt, applied to the bench this day for a transfer of licence of the Junction Inn, Moama, from Mr Jeremiah Rolfe, the present landlord, to James Maiden, the owner of the premises. Mr Rolfe had purchased the house about 12 months since from Mr Maiden, who now repurchased it. Mr Maiden, in obtaining his transfer, stated that he intended to conduct the inn in a very superior manner, that in every department there would immediately be found a marked improvement with a considerable reduction in the charges. He lowered his stabling fee to 10 shillings per night for hay and corn. The glass of grog would be 1 shilling instead of 1 shilling and sixpence. In beds and foods, a corresponding reduction in prices would be made. The brick house, formerly his private residence, would now form part of the accommodation of the hotel. This new building would be set apart for the use of gentlemen and their families travelling to and from Melbourne. Mr Maiden states that he did not consider that he was doing more than his duty in meeting the altered circumstances of the times. He was now enabled to get carriage from Melbourne at £8 per tonne. The wages of the working classes were located in this district of the bush had been greatly lowered, and he thought these things required a consideration. The transfer was immediately granted, and 5 months later states that there were large numbers of cattle, chiefly store cattle, now arriving at and crossing the Edward River, with 2,800 head of cattle for Mr James Maiden. And a letter to the editor of the Argus titled Advance Murray River. It says, Sir, the steamer Muggawankie by Captain Webb arrived here last Tuesday evening from Adelaide with a general cargo consisting of flour, tea and sugar, for which a ready sale was effected at remunerating prices to parties at the Edward River. The steamer sailed today for a full cargo engaged for her return trip. Several settlers took the opportunity of returning to their stations on the Lower Murray. Look out, Melbourne, as the depot at Maiden's Punt will supply not only the diggings but the whole of the vast northern districts. Goods can be landed at the Edward, Billabong, Lower Edward, Lower Murrumbidgee, and for 200 miles on the Lachlan River, cheaper than they can be obtained via Melbourne, Bathurst, Goulburn Plains or Yass. These are plain facts for the people. Respectfully yours, James Maiden. And in the Perth Gazette and Independent Journal of Politics and News in Western Australia on the 3rd of October 1856. An article titled A Model Colonist. The following interesting account of the career of James Maiden is written by a correspondent of the Sydney Morning Herald. After all that is written and said upon colonisation, success has for its basis hard work. Who works the hardest mentally and bodily gets the most. We are not now speaking of colonisation as accepted by the large mass of people who confine their thoughts and actions to the great colonial towns. They do not colonise. With them, life differs but little from life in England. It's the men on the extreme outskirts of civilization who first tread the ground, which the foot of the white man has rarely before passed over, that colonise as we in the far bush interpret the term. Mr. James Maiden, whose name must be familiar to a large proportion of inhabitants of New South Wales and adjoining colonies, first became a border man 16 years ago. In 1840, he first crossed the Murray in the employ of Mr. Purcellwaite in order to settle on that part of the cow pasture known as Jeffrey Station, 25 miles from the junction of the latter river with the Murray. This was an antecedent to the great rush of settlers from Manaroo and the adjacent country to the borders of the Edward and the Murray and the outskirts of Port Phillip, which was then termed the New Country. Mr. Maiden, having done the work assigned to him by his employer, went back to Seymour for a time. In a short period, fortune drifted him in the direction of the Murray and the Edward, and he settled down on Morago with Healyman on the Edward. Maiden was at this time but little in position above a labouring man, but parties who were acquainted with him for some time previous to this state that he was always recognised as a very superior man for his station, possessed of great shrewdness, or what is denominated natural talent, with more than average share of physical energy. Maiden about this time became connected with a settler of the name of Clark, to whom he was related by marriage, and for whom, on Maiden leaving the stations on the Edward, he brought a large number of cattle down to this favoured portion of the Murray. The locality in which he was then for many years to act a prominent part seemed to have an uncommon attraction for him. Perhaps it was that he saw a wide opening for an active-minded man. It was untrodden ground whereon one who sowed might safely expect to reap. Travelling with cattle then was a different affair to what it now is. The country was, as we have said, uninhabited, a trackless waste. There were no yards wherein to stow safely your herds, no comfortable hotel, as now, wherein speculators could put up nightly, eat and drink well, and calculate their gains from the prices current of the daily journals of the colonies. Camping out day and night, crossing the lagoons and rivers, would certainly convey to him no very pleasing ideas of colonisation. There was also another and a very different affair to contend with, the natives of this part of the country, which were no means desirous of fraternising with the whites. On the contrary, they were very troublesome in driving away and sparing the cattle, and it required a vigilant eye to protect men and cattle from the onslaught of the blacks. In all these disagreeables, Maiden had more than his share, and on one occasion so hostile had the Aboriginals become that he and his wife, the latter in order to deceive the blacks wore male attire, had to stand a siege for many weeks, their hut being surrounded, attacked, and watched day and night, terror having driven away Maiden's mates. After a year or so of roughing it, as the colonial phrase goes, exerting his energies in the service of others, Maiden began to turn his attention to setting up for himself. The start in life is the thing, how to set the machine in motion and then to keep it going. There are the two phases of Australian life. Maiden's means were small, very small. The Murray here, as in its whole length, was without a punt. The white man being up to this time under the necessity of imitating the blackfellow by crossing this stream in a frail bark canoe. But Maiden slightly improved this by building a small punt for which he for a time worked himself. Thus it carried Caesar and his fortunes. This was in 1843, the date of the foundation of his prosperity. By diligently plying this little punt for 2 years, Maiden was enabled to build the large one so well known throughout these colonies as Maiden's Punt. He now removed the small punt to the Edward River at Diniliquin, and thus he had the command of the two crossing places. Following up his good fortune, in July 1846 he opened the licence house The Junction Inn, and Maiden's worldly prosperity improved rapidly. Postal communication now began to occupy his attention, and he established a private mail run from Seymour to Diniliquin. Money for those contracts was raised by private subscriptions among the few settlers on the route. For the Seymour and Diniliquin mail, Maiden received the magnificent sum of £50 per annum, and for the Murray and Moolameen one he also realised £50 for the year, the sum being made up by subscriptions of 50 shillings each settler who received his letters by this medium. The Kilmore and Diniliquin post, about 150 miles in length, obtained the sum of £40. If carried out according to the present rate of payment for the same work, it would amount to something like £700. For several years, Maiden held these contracts or subcontracts. He was always a hard worker himself, and those under him were compelled to follow his example. When the gold discovery changed the face of things in Australia, it found Maiden a man of substance for those days, and ultimately when the famous Bendigo first astonished the people of these colonies, Maiden, distant about 55 miles from this Goliath of all the goldfields, received an additional impetus on the road to fortune. He immediately began buying gold and fitting out parties for the diggings until he drew down upon him the wrath of the neighbouring settlers, because, as they alleged, he encouraged their men to desert their hired service. These imagined ruin stared them in the face. Their flocks and herds were deserted. Maiden was therefore made the scapegoat for the sins of a great many runaways, with whose absence from their legitimate employers he had, as he said, neither act nor part. Settlers determined on a victim and positively met in Maiden's own inn to consider the best means of depriving him of his licence. He called for proof of his complicity in the guilt of the missing shepherds and stockmen. None being forthcoming, the wrathful settlers were checkmate in the movement. Maiden soothingly assured them the tide would soon turn in their favour. The tens of thousands flocking to the Bendigo would require a lot of animal food. The settlers would thus have a market for their cattle and sheep in the room of boiling them down. This foresight of Maiden's was rapidly realised. In less than 3 short years, some of the settlers who wished to take away Maiden's licence had gone home to England with ample fortunes. This unpleasant affair having thus passed over, Maiden felt that he wanted elbow room. Punt, post and public house were now subordinate matters, and he looked for a wider sphere for the exercise of his undeniable talents. To supply the Bendigo with cattle and sheep was his aim. No light matter to provide chops and steaks for 100,000 diggers. With limited capital, however, he commenced the enterprise. By gradually creeping onwards, boldly but cautiously making his purchases, he soon accomplished this, and he soon had also a very fair shape in the supply of Melbourne. Beginning with purchases of hundreds of pounds, he advanced to thousands, from thousands to tens of thousands. Stock alone have not occupied his attention, but in stations and land he had invested largely. He had purchased 17 runs, for one of which alone he paid 40,000 guineas. He owned 18,000 head of horned cattle, many thousands of sheep, about 500 horses, and he had in his employ 100 men, nearly all of them occupied in driving stock. He owned land in various parts of New South Wales and Victoria, which in itself would make him a wealthy man. All the township of Moama, or Maiden's Punt, save a few allotments, was his. He was still a publican and postmaster. In fact, it is difficult to say what he was not, excepting that he was not an idler. The men of the rank from which he sprung look upon Maiden as a god. With them the wonder has been that one small head could carry all he knew. Those who are far above him in education and station, Maiden made no secret that he could neither read nor write, seek and receive his counsel. He certainly is a colonial phenomenon. His public house, like himself, has crept on space from its original size to a large inn, wherein more business is transacted in cattle and sheep than perhaps in any houses in these colonies. Those who have had an opportunity of judging estimate that in Maiden's big parlour bargains to the amount of £250,000 are annually made. Maiden's purchases reached £100,000 in a year. One of his latest investments, Paracoola on the Murray, late the property of Mr. Henry Bawtree, was purchased for £11,000 and is not the least remarkable of Maiden's notions. This run used to be a paddock. It has a water frontage to the Murray of about 10 miles. From each of the points on the river, a 2-rail fence, 40 miles long, is in the course of erection and nearly completed for the purpose of enclosing thousands of cattle. In this depot, it is Maiden's intention to store a large supply in order to enable him to make his rush into any of the markets in Victoria when it suits his objects to do so. In his extensive dealings, it is not to be supposed that Maiden has not acquired a large proportion of his knowledge practically, nor, it can be denied on the other hand, that he has brought to bear a large amount of sagacity, almost amounting to intuitiveness, on this experience. Some men are born to greatness, others have greatness thrust upon them. Short-sighted people, in reviewing Maiden's rapid rise and prosperous career, attribute his success to his local position, to his being on one of the great highways over which an enormous quantity of cattle and sheep pour in from New South Wales into Victoria. Doubtless this has something to do with it, but a very small minority of mankind succeed in grasping the prizes within their reach. Of those who do succeed this far, how few of them retain the prize when clutched? It is not a high order of talent, certainly this money-making. Nevertheless, there is an amount of calculation and foresight in order to ensure continued success that our worldly philosophy cannot afford to despise. Maiden has worked the oracle, as we term it, well. In fact, he has now reduced cattle dealing to something like a system or science. Always in the market, this is the real secret success, he feels secure. Of course, he must sometimes lose. Still, it is in the skill required in order to avoid playing, often the losing game, that has placed Maiden far above those who compete with him. He has competitors, there are many of them, made of the same stuff as himself, full of energy and enterprise, who pursue their object with perseverance which almost commands a good fortune. So on the 1st of October 1846, it mentions that Maiden, at his own cost, proposes to put another punt on the Murray at Moama, and to enable him to do so, the public are memorialising Sir William Denison. The memorial, which is subjoined, exhibits the withering effects of centralisation as compared to private enterprise. It also affords some data as to the vast extent of trade in livestock between New South Wales and Victoria. The following is the memorial. To His Excellency Sir William Thomas Denison, Captain General and Governor in Chief of the Colony of New South Wales. The memorial of the undersigned colonists of New South Wales and other interested in the cattle trade between New South Wales and Victoria. She with that for several years past there's been an extensive trade in horned cattle, horses and sheep between New South Wales and Victoria by way of Maiden's Punt, situated on the River Murray. The said punt was built by James Maiden of Moama some years since, that, in consequence of the importance of this crossing place, laid out a township at Moama aforesaid on the New South Wales side, and a large quantity of land has been sold here from time to time. The trade in horned cattle, horses and sheep has increased and is still likely to increase, and it is estimated that between 300,000 and 400,000 sheep, 30,000 head of horned cattle and over 4,000 horses annually cross the Murray at this punt. That the said punt was owned by and under the management of the said James Maiden until 1852, when the government of Victoria compelled him, by force of statute enactment, to dispose of the said punt to them. That since the event last referred to, the said punt, owing to the gross neglect and lack of management by the parties appointed to work it by the government of Victoria, it has become unsafe, and to the great loss and inconvenience of your memorialists and others interested in the trade. That, in consequence of the neglect and mismanagement, the said township of Moama is likely to recede in the room of participating in the growing prosperity of the district, thus rendering the land bought by the government of New South Wales of less value, to the pecuniary loss of the inhabitants of Moama, who have become purchasers, and to the inevitable loss of the government in further disposal of land so situated. That, setting aside this neglect and mismanagement of the present punt, your memorialise would beg to call your Excellency's attention to the fact that the existing punt is by far too small to meet the increased traffic, the punt being only 66 feet long by 13 broad and can only carry 200 sheep at a time, thus occasioning great loss and delay in the transit of large quantities of sheep as travelling in lots occasionally numbering up to 10,000. That your memorialists have heard with much satisfaction that James Maiden, in constructing a large, safe and commodious punt, 90 feet in length by 18 in breadth, capable of carrying 500 sheep at a time across the River Murray, with the hope that your Excellency's government will grant him permission to ply the said punt at Moama under the government regulations of the colony of New South Wales. Your memorialists therefore pray that your Excellency will grant to the said James Maiden the necessary licence for plying the said punt when properly completed, subject to the rules and regulations governing ferries in New South Wales, so that the wants of your memorialists and the public may be supplied, and in order that the land sold at Moama and hereafter would not suffer by the want of efficient means to secure the district a good and safe ferry with a proper punt. I have no doubt that the amount of stock is far more than is mentioned in the memorial. Let us, however, take it as stated and try by this means to get an approximation to the gross value of this trade throughout our district. 400,000 sheep at 10 shillings each, 30,000 head of cattle at £6 each, and 4,000 horses at £20 each gives a total of £460,000, or in round numbers, say £500,000 annually. We are now under the mark, and there is another crossing place at Albury and a third at Swan Hill. It must be understood that all those cattle refer to Hopwood's as well as Maiden's, as in the computation for the two ferries merged. $1 million of money would not cover the gross amount in the value of stock going into Victoria over the Murray. Yet Mr. Postmaster General in Sydney coolly wrote to us the other day, stating that unless we could procure a house for a post office free of charge, that he must stop our mail. The government could not afford £20 for a post office and £10 for a postmaster. What encouragement for private enterprise! How they do assist us in local improvements. On the 1st of October 1856, an article stated that Maiden's punt was built 11 years ago by James Maiden, under whose hand it was kept in good repair until 1851, when the Victorian government gave Mr. Maiden the choice of two alternatives, either to sell his interest in the punt to them or allow them to fix a scale of fees. Unfortunately for himself and the public, he chose the former to avoid, as he thought, the interference of government in what had hitherto been free. He sold his interest to that government, through whose parsimony and the surveyor's partiality for a pet township, Maiden's punt has been allowed to get into its present dilapidated condition. Yet notwithstanding all of its advantages, and all that Mr. Hopwood can or will write in praise of Echuca, Maiden's punt has those natural advantages that will enable it to continue where it has hitherto been, the main crossing place of the Murray and the great central depot for stock of every description. However, I am inclined to think that better days are in store for Moama, as Mr. Maiden has contracted with Mr. Henry Leonard, the well-known builder of several steamers now afloat on the Murray belonging to the RMN Company, to build a punt for this place 90 feet in length by 22 feet in width, and estimated to carry 800 to 1,000 sheep each trip, instead of 500. I believe it is also the intention of a party to build a substantial bridge over that dangerous and very often fatal stream, the Campaspe, in connection with the above, as soon as the flood subsides, and the necessary arrangements can be made with government for that purpose. On the 5th of February 1857, an article titled Agricultural Produce. We observe by our advertising column that Mr. James Maiden announces for sale 6,000 bushels of wheat, the produce of his farm at the junction of the Wild Duck and McIver Creeks. The wheat is spoken of as first-rate description. We take the opportunity of noticing this announcement as one truly gratifying to all who take an interest in the permanent prosperity of the district and who appreciates the advantages of having extensive agricultural resources to rely upon. 22nd of May 1857, a great and valuable description of landed property comprising farms of a very productive and highly cultivated nature, situate in a choice agricultural part of the colony, has just been announced for lease by tender by Mr. Emmett, no less than a portion of the magnificent estate of James Maiden, Esquire, that gentleman wishing to return and visit the land of his nativity. On the 9th of August 1858, James purchases 20,000 sheep. On the same day, though, there is an article in the newspaper from the Supreme Court, Maiden versus Starr. This was an action for non-delivery of sheep according to an agreement, and damages were laid at £6,000. The plaintiff in this action is a Mr. Maiden, the proprietor of Maiden's Punt, who is also an extensive squatter. The defendant, who resides at New England, is also a squatter. In July 1856, the defendant called in at the plaintiff's place on the Murray and entered into a negotiation with him for the sale of 20,000 sheep to be put on Maiden's runs for the purpose of being fattened. The following agreement for the sale of the sheep was then entered into by both parties. Memorandum of agreement made on the 30th of July 1856 between James Starr, Esquire, on one part, and James Maiden of the Murray River, and on the other, James Starr hereby agrees to sell, and James Maiden hereby agrees to purchase 20,000 sheep, consisting of 10,000 wethers and 10,000 ewes, at the price of 8 shillings 6 per head. The said sheep to be delivered at Mr. Maiden's station at South Thononga, Lachlan River, at any time between the 1st of March and the 1st of June. Payment to be made, one half by cash on the delivery of the sheep, and the remainder by acceptance of Rowan Company of Melbourne to James Maiden at 6 months' date from the day of delivery, and signed by both men. A few days after the contract was entered into, the defendant came down to Melbourne, called on Messrs. Rowe and Kirk, who were at the time acting agents for Mr. Maiden. He had a conversation with Mr. Kirk, whom he asked if he would pay Mr. Maiden's bill. Mr. Kirk said he knew nothing about 13,000 sheep which Starr stated he had sold, but that he should write to Mr. Maiden about the transaction and that he should receive payment when he received a reply. Mr. Kirk, however, offered to put down £500 for the performance of the contract on Maiden's part if he would deposit the same amount for his own part of the performance, and this was declined. It appears that Mr. Maiden, after making arrangements for the payment of the sheep with Mr. Kirk, gave instructions to his overseer, Mr. Denny, to proceed into the bush and look out for a large flock of sheep. He did so, but finding no traces of the sheep, he returned after travelling 250 miles along the Murray. The sheep did not arrive. A few days afterwards, Mr. Maiden purchased a similar number at a serious loss from Mr. Allison. He sustained a loss by reason of non-delivery of £6,000, and the present action was brought for recovery of that amount. After hearing a great deal of evidence and the addresses of the council, His Honour summed up, and the jury returned a verdict for the plaintiff with damages of £5,000. So as you may have gathered, James Maiden became a millionaire. He had many ventures and owned a lot of land. He made a lot of money out of supplying the gold diggers with meat, but with a downturn in the market and the gold running out, there was a huge flood on the Murray as well that flooded Moama, and it recovered very slowly from this. It hung on, and in the 1860s, police barracks, a school, post and telegraph office and a customs office were established, giving an air of permanency to the township. This is when James Maiden fell on hard times and sold his interests around Moama, lost all of his money, and he began to work odd jobs around the Bendigo district. And the remains of the old Junction Inn, built and owned by James Maiden, was destroyed by fire in 1937, and all that remains is the front section with the pylons. It does have a historical marker for tourists to read. James died, thought to be a pauper, on the 28th of December 1869 at the age of 60 in Bendigo of bronchitis. His obituary reads, "Another of the early border pioneers has departed this life. Mr. James Maiden, so well known as the founder of the town of Moama, died in Bendigo Hospital on Tuesday. It appears that he'd been admitted to that institution 6 weeks previously, suffering from disease of the lungs. He had been for some time ailing, and his death was caused by a complaint in the lungs, together with a general break-up of the system." Mr. Maiden first arrived on this part of the Murray in 1843 when he brought a herd of cattle down the river, with which he occupied country a little below Turringabby Station. In 1846 he commenced to build the Junction Inn at Moama. In this house Mr. Maiden made a great deal of money and was at one time worth many thousands. He became proprietor of Echuca Station, which together with Turringabby he held for a considerable time. He was a man of great natural ability, of much energy and enterprise, but being uneducated, his undertakings became too complicated for his management, and after a splendid run of good fortune, his affairs became entangled. Difficulties increased every year, and he at length found himself reduced from the position of an extremely rich man to a condition of poverty. He never retrieved his fortunes, and has been for some years in very poor circumstances. In the height of his fortune, one of the chief aims of his ambition was to render Moama a place of more importance than Echuca, which was founded by Mr. Hopwood in 1853. A considerable degree of rivalry existed between them, and many amusing stories are told of the tactics pursued by the kings of the two border towns. This warfare carried on until Mr. Maiden was compelled, through his pecuniary difficulties, to retire from the field. It is somewhat remarkable that within a few days of 12 months, one of these veteran pioneers should have followed the other to the grave, Mr. Hopwood having died last New Year's Day. They were within a few years of the same age, and both of the men were of iron constitutions, which shortly before their deaths completely gave away. Notwithstanding the long and warm opposition which was carried on between them in business, no personal animosity appeared to exist between them, and in the latter years of their lives they always met as old friends and acquaintances, and conversed jocularly of past times. Mr. Maiden always said that Mr. Hopwood fought him fairly, and attributed his failure to very different causes than his persistent opposition. They are now both gone, and we can only say peace to their ashes. In part 2 of this episode, I'll be covering James Maiden's family and what became of them.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.